One tornado, one town, 161 people gone. And most Americans can't even tell you the year it happened. Joplin, Missouri, May 22nd, 2011. The deadliest single tornado since the United States began keeping official records back in 1950. Not the 1920s. Not some faded tragedy from a century ago that you'd expect nobody to recall. 15 years back. Recent enough that the people who lived it are still walking around, still telling the story to anyone who'll listen. And it's already slipping out of the national memory like it barely happened. That should bother you. A quiet Sunday evening became the worst tornado disaster this country has ever seen in the modern age. And the very thing built to protect that town played a part in why so many of its people never made it through the night. This is what actually happened. Consider this point. This was not a surprise. The National Weather Service pushed out a tornado warning at 5:17 in the evening, a full 17 minutes before the storm even touched the ground. 17 minutes. In tornado terms, that's an eternity. That's enough time to grab your kids, get to the lowest room in the house, and pull a mattress over your heads. So why did so many people stay standing in their kitchens and driveways? Because they couldn't see it coming. This tornado was what forecasters call rain-wrapped. It buried itself inside a heavy downpour, a thick curtain of water so heavy that people staring straight at it saw nothing but gray sky and sheets of rain. No classic funnel, no spinning cone crawling across the horizon like the ones you've seen in photos. Just wind, water, and a growing roar. By the time folks finally understood what was tearing toward them, the window to hide had already slammed shut. So how does a fully worn town still lose that many people in one evening? Subscribe, and you'll start noticing how often the systems built to protect us fail, at the exact moment they matter most. Now let's talk about the Sirens, because this is where the story turns ugly. Joplin had 25 tornado sirens spread across the city. Every single one of them worked. Not one failed. So throw out any story you've heard about broken equipment or a warning system that let people down, because that's not what happened here. The sirens first went off at 5:11 in the evening for a completely different storm passing to the north, and nothing came of it. No damage, no touchdown. Just a loud alarm and a clear sky where the danger was supposed to be. Sound familiar? A warning that cries wolf. So when the sirens screamed a second time at 5:38, an entire town had already made up its mind. False alarm. 27 minutes sat between those two warnings, and in that gap, a city quietly talked itself out of being afraid. They call it siren fatigue. You hear the alarm, you see nothing, you stop believing. That's it. That's the trap. The sirens did their job perfectly, and it didn't matter. At 5:34 in the evening, it droped out of the rain just west of town. And within minutes, it grew into something that barely sounds real. Picture a wall of wind 1 mile wide, not 1 mile long, 1 mile across, grinding through neighborhoods block by block. Winds with peak gusts estimated as high as 200 to 250 miles an hour. It clawed along the ground for 21.62 miles, a track measured down to the 100th of a mile, because the destruction carved such a clean, merciless line straight across the map. 21 miles. On the ground. Refusing to lift. At 5:41, it crossed into the Joplin city limits. And for the next 38 minutes, it did not let up. Not once, until it finally tore itself apart at 6:12. That's a long time to live inside the worst moment of your life. And then it found the hospital. St. John's Regional Medical Center. Multiple stories of concrete, steel, and stone, the kind of building you'd bet your life could survive anything. It couldn't. At roughly 5:42, the tornado slammed straight into it, tore the power clean out, and gutted the structure in 45 seconds. 45 seconds to break a hospital. Inside, in total darkness, an emergency room doctor named Kevin Kikta and a pregnant nurse named Shiloh Cook squeezed under a small desk. They felt the pressure crush against their eardrums. They heard the sound every survivor describes, a roar like a freight train barreling through the room. As an entire medical center came apart around two people hiding beneath a piece of office furniture. And here is what many people get completely wrong. That building was not picked up and spun off its foundation. That's a myth that keeps getting repeated. The concrete cracked so badly it had to be demolished later, but it never actually moved. What shattered was everything inside it. If this is hitting you the way it should, take a second to tap like. It genuinely helps push this story toward people who've never heard a single word about what Joplin lived through. Now here is a face for all of it. Shelley Thomas. When the walls started ripping apart around them, she didn't freeze and she didn't run. She threw her own body over her son's and turned herself into a shield, taking the brunt of the flying debris so it would never reach them. When the roar finally faded, Shelley was bruised and battered, having taken the brunt of whatever the wind had turned into flying weapons. And her boys? Not a scratch. Not one of them. Think about that for a second. A mother's body braced against a 200-mile-an-hour wind, and she won. That's the story that should have been on every front page in the country. And that town is full of moments exactly like it. Ordinary people doing impossible things. Yet almost nobody outside Joplin ever learned her name. And then there's the part that raises the hair on your arms. In the days after, something strange surfaced. Children who'd survived inside the wreckage, kids who didn't know one another, kids scattered across totally different parts of the destruction, started telling the same story. They described glowing figures with wings. They called them the Buterfly people. They said these winged shapes hovered above them and blocked the flying debris, shielding their small bodies from the storm. Multiple children, similar descriptions, no coordination between them. So what do you do with that? Believe whatever you want. Call it trauma. Call it the mind protecting itself. Call it something you can't explain at all. But a group of young kids who never met, each one separately describing the exact same glowing, winged protectors. During the worst night of their lives? That's the detail that lingers long after the statistics blur together. Now look at what was left behind. 7,500 homes. Damaged or wiped completely off the map. Not dented. Not scratched. Erased. Entire streets where you couldn't tell where one house ended and the next began, because there was nothing left standing to mark the line between them. $2.8 billion in damage, counted in 2011 money. That figure makes Joplin the most expensive single tornado in the entire history of the United States. Not one of the worst. The most. One storm. One evening, and it out-damaged every other tornado this country has ever put on record. How does a disaster that large just quietly drift out of the conversation? But watch what that town did next. Exactly 1 week later, on May 29th, a working field hospital opened in a parking lot. A working field hospital, raised from nothing, on the same concrete where cars used to sit. To replace the medical center the tornado had gutted. 7 days, from ruin to running. That's Joplin. And that stubborn refusal to stay down deserves just as much attention as the horror that came before it. You had a community that lost its main hospital, thousands of homes, and so many of its own people. And inside a single week, it was already stitching itself back together with whatever it had left. No waiting for permission, no paralysis. They just started rebuilding. Here's a fight almost nobody hears about. Officially, the Joplin tornado carries an EF5 rating, the very top of the scale. The worst nature is known to throw. But some of the engineers who walked that wreckage afterward argued it should have landed one notch lower at EF4. Their reasoning? A lot of Joplin's houses were poorly constructed, and poorly built homes get swept away by weaker winds. If the structures were fragile to begin with, the total flattening might make the wind look stronger than it truly was. Cold logic, and a painful thing to hear when you've just lost everything you owned. But whether you write a 4 or a 5 on the report, the truth on the ground never changed. A town was gone. The number an engineer stamps on a survey doesn't bring back a single one of the people who died that evening. So why doesn't the rest of the country remember? Maybe because Joplin isn't a giant metro on the coast. Maybe because it struck on a sleepy Sunday. in a corner of Missouri most people never think twice about, but the story keeps clawing its way back into the light. In March 2025, a documentary called The Twister, Caught in the Storm, dropped on Netflix, putting the survivors face to face with the world again. In May 2026, the town marked 15 years since that evening, paired with a Weather Channel special titled Joplin 15 Years Later. And the sky still isn't finished with them. On April 24th, 2026, a small, unwarned tornado touched down on the west side of Joplin and tore up trees over at Schifferdecker Park. No injuries that time, but imagine living there. Imagine what the sound of rising wind does to that town 15 years on. 161. Say that number out loud. That's how many people a single, fully warned storm took one Sunday evening, in a town the rest of the country has quietly agreed to forget. The warning came early. The sirens screamed twice. And it still wasn't enough, because the deadliest thing that night wasn't the wind at all. It was the belief that it couldn't happen here. If this story got under your skin the way it should, like and subscribe, because these are exactly the ones history tries to erase, and Joplin has earned the right to be remembered.